All right, so welcome to our penultimate session for semester 1, 2025. We have one more talk in 2 weeks' time by our own Nicole Kimball, who will be talking to us on abjection and anxiety, the metamorphosis of the Roman literary witch. So it'll be really interesting, I imagine. But today I am glad to welcome Matthew Firth. Before we get started, though, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded land of the Pamalong clan of the Awabakal Nation and pay respect to elders past and present. So Matthew is a research fellow in medieval history at Flinders University, supported by an ARC Discovery or DECRA Discovery Early Career Research Award, very prestigious, especially, and it's exceedingly rare in any sort of pre-modern context. So we're very happy for him. And his project is called Contesting Conquest, Pre-Modern Attempts to Come to Terms with the Past. Matthew has been very diligent in the past few years. After receiving his PhD in 2022, he's already published 2 monographs, an edited volume, and is, I believe, working on another special journal issue. So he's continually producing material. And we're very pleased to have him here today to talk to us about medieval life writing and the legacy of King Edgar, a friend to be feared. So I will now share the screen and pass it off in just a moment to Matthew, and we'll begin in earnest.
Excellent. Thanks, Ryan. Look, if you want to be as productive as me, just don't have any hobbies. Whenever I meet the owners of my daughter's friends, they ask me what my hobbies are. Work. But look, this is sort of a side project that I'm speaking about today. So I've got a couple of funders I need to acknowledge up there, and this work is actually coming from work done, a project from the Australian Historical Association and the Australian Academy of the Humanities, which links into my DECRA project, but mainly looks at the way that medieval lives are being written. I use the term life writing. It's quite a now term. It's a very current piece of terminology, and that's because it applies to biography beyond traditional biographical writing. And as you'll see as we go through here, we're going to look at charters, we're going to look at portraiture, I'm going to have a few coins up there. We're going to look at hagiography, not about Edgar, not about our subject, but hagiographies in which he appears, so hagiography, saints' lives. And life writing covers all of these things that give us glimpses both into how the king wanted to represent himself and how other people come to represent him. I'm going to keep quite focused on the 10th to 12th century. So Edgar is a 10th century king, starts reigning in the year 959. And I'm going to go up to the 12th century. In the 12th century, we have this real burgeoning of historiographical writing in England. It's after the Norman conquest. Everybody starts to be interested in what the roots of these institutions they've inherited are. So they're trying to pin Anglo-Norman kingship back to Anglo-Saxon kingship, try to demonstrate continuity of the church across the conquest, this sort of thing. So we see a lot of lives and legacies get repurposed. Now, in theory, we could go all the way up to the modern period, and that's what the wider project will do. But we've only got 40 minutes, so we can't do everything. All right, next slide, please. So I'm going to start with some historical background because you need it. Our focus is on Edgar. Edgar is generally thought to be one of the foundational figures for a single English kingdom. A lot of people point to his uncle, King Athelstan, as the first king of all the English. The thing is, when Athelstan creates this English kingdom out of all of the small composite kingdoms that existed before, it's a personal union. He dies, it all falls apart. Edgar is the first guy to sort of put laws in place that covers the entire kingdom. And after Edgar, we always have a single English kingdom. Okay, so he's born around 943. He's the youngest of King Edmund the first two sons. And I'm sorry about all the names that all start with E or A. King Edmund dies. The crown passes to King Edmund's brother Eadred. 955, Eadred dies, and we often get this horizontal succession between brothers. We'll see that twice here. So the crown passes to his oldest nephew, Eadwy. He's only about 15 years old. I've written a lot about Eadwy. Eadwy is very much demonized in our literature because he tries to start a new faction. He tries to get away from the advisors of his father and uncle's courts. He brings new people to court, and he sidelines a lot of people who will become very important later on. He dies quite young. He's only about 20 when he dies. So he doesn't outlive all of these important politicians. So he gets demonized in the literature that follows. It's very hard to find that he has any contemporary representations of Eadwy with a good character. You know, there are some fabulous stories attached to him, but we won't go down that particular route. But what does happen is this factionalism means that we wind up with two English courts. Eadwy is reigning south of the Thames, Edgar's reigning north of the Thames. Edgar grabs all of those guys that Eadwy has sidelined, and he brings them north with him. Now, I say he grabs them, but Edgar is probably only about 13 at this point in time. So it would be more accurate to say all these sidelined political figures grab Edgar and take him north and say, now you're our king. And then Eadwy can't do anything about this. Okay, he doesn't have the political power. So it remains divided until Eadwy dies and Edgar becomes the king of a reunified England. He rewards his key supporters, but he does not do the same thing as his brother. All of the new magnates his brother has put in place get to keep their lands. So he prefers political stability. He learns some lessons out of his brother's reign. But most importantly, he installs Bishop Dunstan as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay, and Dunstan will be our constant companion through all of this because most of what we get about Edgar is written through the lens of Dunstan's life. Okay, because Dunstan becomes a saint, and of course we write lots of literature around saints in the intellectual milieu of 10th century England. Kings are sort of tangential. They show up in sort of longer form histories or within other people's biographies. 973, we have this interesting thing where Edgar is crowned for a second time in a pseudo-imperial coronation ceremony in Bath and in Bristol. Again, that's important to know because we're going to come up with this story that he has to serve penance for 7 years. And the purpose of this second coronation is to mark the end of that penance, that he's sort of allowed to be king in his own right again. But there's a lot of symbolism, particularly in Bristol when they're rowing up the Dee. He has 5 Welsh kings and the Scottish king row him up the Dee in a boat as he stands at the prow. Okay, so this is a real statement, not that I'm king of England, but I am all of Britain, all of Albion. And then in 975, King Edgar dies and factions form around his sons Edward the Martyr and Ethelred the Unready. Exactly the same factions that formed around these two earlier brothers, Eadwy and Edgar. Okay, a lot of those same advisors are still alive. Everyone splits in the same way. No prizes for guessing how Edward the Martyr sees out his days. He doesn't last particularly long. Next slide. Okay, so that's the historical background. It's probably as dry as it will get because some of the stories that, oh no, we're going to look at a charter. That's as dry as it will get. After that, we're going to look at some of these fabulous stories that grow up around Edgar. That said, he has some of the more interesting charters. This is just one example. He has nearly 200 charters in existence. That's far more than any other Anglo-Saxon king, with the exception of Edward the Confessor. This picture here is from the frontispiece of the Newminster Winchester Refoundation Charter. It ties in with the church reforms that are going on at this time. So Edgar is allied with both St. Dunstan and with St. Athelwold. St. Athelwold is the Bishop of Winchester. Athelwold probably wrote all of this, but it still represents how the king wants to represent himself. Okay, so in our proem, we've got King Edgar promulgated this privilege for the new minster and granted it to the Almighty Lord and his mother Mary, praising his great work. So we've got this real sense of piety, and piety goes through all of his stories, even when he's abducting nuns. Okay, he's still very much willing to do the penance for his crimes. And then in the body, the start of the body, hence I, Edgar, king of all Albion. Okay, again, he's making this assertion that he's over king of the entire island. While the divine grace favours had begun earnestly to investigate what works I might engage with zeal, so that attaining such great glory, placed in heaven, Christ and his saints furnished with crown, I might delight in the common dwelling. I want to do these things so I can go to heaven. If effectively. Now, every charter has a witness list. Witness lists are very important because they more or less tell you who is important at court at that time. So the first witness is almost always the king, and then they go in descending order of importance. Usually you have an archbishop next. We have Archbishop Dunstan. But this chart is interesting because it also shows us his succession planning. So we have the king, we have Dunstan, then we have his infant son, who's all of 9 months old, so obviously not really witnessing. Then we have his consort, who is named legitima conjuns, legitimate wife, so really emphasizing the legitimacy here. And then we get his sons from an earlier marriage, and the word legitimate is not attached to them. So they're older sons, but they're lower on the list. He's really establishing, or along with Athelwald, this idea of sacral kingship, of legitimacy, of children being born in the purple, so being born during a king's reign, having some sort of primacy. Okay, I put this up here because I wanted you to see how he's representing himself. We don't get a lot of contemporary information from these kings where you sort of get a glimpse into what they are doing. It's pretty much charters and coins. Otherwise, you're getting external views. All right, next slide. So the closest thing we have to contemporary chronicles, and look, I put the Old English up there just because people don't usually get to see Old English, so it's a bit of fun for you. Once we get some of the quotes from the Latin chronicles later on, I'll not have the original language up there. Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, deeply complicated source. We have 7 existing manuscripts that all vary slightly. The genesis for them is in the late 9th century, in the reign of King Alfred the Great. He has this sort of rejuvenation of English learning, and he asks his clerics to compile a history. They do that, and they send it out to all these other ecclesiastical centres who do their own continuations. As far as these sort of late 10th century entries go, we have 2 traditions. We have that in the chronicles we call A, B, and C, and then we have that in the chronicles we call D and E. All appear to be written as verse, very hard to tell in medieval literature. When you get a manuscript, they don't write it out like this, it's just written in lines. And a lot of English poetry is not rhyming, it's to do with alliteration, so unless you're reading it out loud, you often don't get the sense of it. This is certainly a poem. The next one is a bit more contested. So we get all of the main bits and pieces about Edgar's life here. He was the ruler of the English. He has this second coronation. So everyone focuses in on this second coronation late in life in 973 in the ancient city named Bath. And there was great rejoicing come to all on that blessed day, which children of men named called Pentecost, that were gathered a crowd of priests. Interestingly, if I translated literally, it would have sounded really colloquial, but it actually says, there was gathered a heap of priests. A great multitude of monks, as I've heard, and many learned men. Okay, there's nothing negative here. In contemporary records, we get absolutely nothing negative. Now, this is written at about the turn of the century, about 20 years later, so Edgar's already dead, but his son's on the throne. So you have to question what sort of thing it's political, makes political sense to write while the dynasty is still in charge. So if there are rumours going around about some of the things we're going to talk about later, they're in oral law, they're not appearing in our written sources. Even to today, though, Edgar is really thought of as a very critical and important and intelligent king. He was a strategist. He was a great lawmaker. He was a great supporter of the church. He very much founds the character of the English kingdom until 1066. Okay, so there's no question that all of this is in some way true. It's a question of whether things are being selectively excluded. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, now D and E, we're not sure if this is a poem. There are some metrical markings that indicate it might be, but, and I've written it out as a poem, but it's not entirely certain. I want to focus in on this line here, though. In this year died Edgar, ruler of the Angles, friend of the West Saxons, and protector of the Mercians. Now, if we look at the second line there, Westseaxena wina und mercena mundobora, okay, that could be a great example of poetry. Okay, you've got Westseaxena wina, And then you've got the parallel, Merchana Mundabora, the WW, the MM, this alliteration that's so common of Old English literature. Our author doesn't do it with the English, though. So the English, the West Saxons, and the Mercians. So then we have to question whether he has chosen this word wiener just because he likes the balance of the line, or if he's choosing a non-alliterative word to go with Angler, whether he is deliberately choosing each of these words to characterize his relationship with each of these nations. Now, the reason I bring that up is this is the only use of the word wiener for friend in the entire of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. So including all the continuations, they span from 60 BC up to about 1142. And this is the only use of this Old English word. And it's a very specific meaning of friend, as I've written down there, applied to one who can help or protect, a friendly lord, a powerful lord. It's not an even relationship. And this is his homeland. Wessex is the homeland of this particular dynasty. So he is presenting himself, or this author, again, around the turn of the 10th century, is presenting him not so much as a friend because he's a nice guy, but a friend because of the safety and security that he can provide his people. And that, partners well with a protector of the Mercians. Although in some way saying he is a protector stops short of claiming overlordship there. And the overlordship of Mercia, which is what you would call the Midlands in England now, is a relatively new thing at this point in time. With Dr. Aaron Sebo at Flinders and Dr. Daniel Anelzark at University of Sydney, we're working on a project on friendship in Old English literature. So that's why that one particularly jumped out at me. I'm not sure that I have any conclusions about it yet, but the word choice there is interesting. And unfortunately, the most likely and most boring explanation is that our guy was just trying to write poetry. He was looking for a good synonym that started with W. But maybe we'll be able to say something more as we continue with that project. Next slide. Okay, an Anglo-Saxon hagiography. I'll sort of gloss over this a little bit, but we have three main reforming clerics during the 10th century. We have Oswald, Athelwold, and Dunstan. They all become saints. They all get their own saints' lives. All of these saints' lives were written very close in time to when they died. So we've got near contemporary views again, and we also have the West Saxon dynasty still on the throne. Okay, so there are a couple of things going on here. One, we're speaking from living memory. Two, we're trying to laud these leading clerics, because of course all of this is written by clerical commentators as well. And then three, we're trying not to offend the reigning dynasty. Okay, so everything's positive here again. We've got these negative things creeping in after the dynasty dies off, but at the moment, if they exist, that's just an oral law. So Firth of Ramsey, now this king, Edgar, mighty in arms, exalting in scepters and diadems and regally protecting the laws of the militant authority, and trampled under his feet all the cowardliness of his enemies. And so we've got a good king. Again, doesn't mean that he's a nice guy, but he's doing the things that we expect a king to do. In the Vita Athelwoldi, we have this emphasis on this personal relationship between Athelwold and Edgar, and this idea that Edgar was a very strong supporter of the church, facilitating the preaching of the gospel. And then in the Vita Dunstani, we've got this prophecy. So when Queen Elfgifu bore a son to the king who became King Edgar the Peacemaker, so we get this sobriquet very early on, 970. So just, about 10 years after his death. And the idea, and I translated as peacemaker, it used to be the peaceable or the peaceful, but he's not actually peaceful. The idea is that he is bringing peace. And, the old adage, if you want peace, prepare for war, that's very much what Edgar does. He has peace because he is very militarily strong, stronger than anyone has been for the prior 70 years. So the prophecy goes, peace be to the church of the English in the time of the child who is now born and avowed Dunstan. Almost everyone knows this came to pass. Okay, so we're framing this in what I would call cultural memory. A cultural memory is a continually adapting form of memory. It is the memory that each generation sort of recreates of the past. Particularly pertinent during an election period. Think about the way that certain groups within society sort of look back to, let's say, the 70s or 80s and think, hey, that was paradigm. That was a perfect time. You sort of, it's an invented memory that glosses over certain bits and pieces. And this is very much the case here. Almost everyone knows this came to pass. Not everyone, but almost everyone knows this came to pass. So we're drawing on cultural memory. You can't go against this common narrative. You can't too wildly invent Edgar, otherwise it rebels against that common knowledge and people don't accept your narrative. You have to work within established traditions in order to create cultural memory. So incremental changes. I talk about cultural memory with my students. I always talk about Ned Kelly, who objectively was a cop killer, but who in current Australian zeitgeist, although it's switching a little bit now, is often thought of as a folk hero. Going back to the Middle Ages, you've got your Robin Hoods, you've got your Grettir's Mundersons we've got exactly the same stories. If you look at them, if you read their stories objectively, not nice guys, still folk heroes. We've got a similar sort of thing going here, except Edgar is a folk hero within the ecclesiastical establishment. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, a reputation in transition. So these are usable past. Usable past is a term that some sociologists came up within the 1970s. I think it's a very useful term still, closely tied to cultural or collective memory. And it's the idea that you can take pieces of the past as didactic or didacticism for the future. Okay? And we will see that a lot with our 12th century chronicles when we get to them. The king at the time, when most of these 12th century chronicles are written, is Henry I. So Edgar is used as a lesson of the way the kingship should work in order to instruct Henry I. And some of this is quite explicit. William of Malmesbury has letters in the front of his chronicle addressing the book to the king. Henry of Huntingdon, when he writes his chronicle, it's for Matilda, the Empress Matilda, who is in the period of the anarchy is one of the people claiming the throne of England. So these are supposed to be didactic histories, usable pasts. Now, one of the quirks we have with William of Malmesbury is that he likes to report everything he comes across. So we do get some very unflattering stories about a lot of these kings, but he always distances himself from them. So we've got, this is the way that he frames it here. Some people try to identify blemishes in his immensely distinguished record, saying that in his early years he was cruel to his subjects and lecherous with young women. Some people, not me, some people, and as a historian, I am just writing these things down. I'm not saying that they're true. He does exactly the same thing with King Athelstan. And interestingly, because we do think of William as a relatively good, almost modern historian, he often tells us his sources. So he'll tell us that he's drawing on old ballads, or he's found a hagiography or a like that we don't have anymore that he's drawing information from. All right, let's pop on to the next one. And now I'm going to get into some of our fun 12th century stories. Okay. Once, for example, at a party where fools often give too free a display of careless talk, the story goes that Kenneth, King of the Scots, said by way of jest that it seemed odd that so many provinces should be ruled by a poor little dwarf. So effectively, you know, the great and noble King of the Scots is calling the King of the English a shorty. Edgar sent for Kenneth as though he wished to consult with him on some great secret. So see how that has already been framed. We know historically that English kings aren't sending for Scottish kings. Scottish kings are not showing up. But this Scottish king does. Kenneth shows up and, having taken him a long way from the forest, offered him 2 swords which he had brought with him. And now, he said, "You are welcome to try your strength as we are alone. For now I shall make quite clear which of us ought rightly to be subject to the other." Kenneth was covered in confusion, daring not to say a word, threw himself at the feet of the Lord his king. Now, William actually does this before he writes the story before he sets up that bit about people blemishing Edgar's record. So to me, that says that William writing in the 12th century, thinks that this is a good story, that this is an example of righteous anger, of appropriate anger. But more importantly, everything about this tells us that the Scots should be subordinated to the English. Okay? So that's the didactic history here. We find, and Kenneth is one of the kings who purportedly rode Edgar up the Dee. So Edgar really did claim overlordship of Scotland, and his coins say Rex Totius Britanniae, king of all Britain. In 1301, when Edward I is writing to the Pope to say, hey, here is my case for being overlord of all Scotland, he draws on Edgar. Edgar is one of the cases he looks at. And he points particularly to the rowing up the Dee, saying, here is an example of the Scottish king's subordination to the English king already. So a lot of historians who focus on the 13th, 14th century point to Edward I as sort of being the first one to establish real overlordship over Scotland. But I think we can quite clearly see William here telling us, or writing this sort of almost propagandist history, that, hey, the kings of Scots have always been subordinated to the English. And if we're assuming again that this is written for an audience of the current English king, Henry I, then this is a lesson for the current English king. Number one, don't let the King of Scots insult you. Number two, you should be king up there. What are you doing? For a lot of these ones, I don't have contemporary images. You know, that frontispiece I showed you from the New Minster Winchester Refoundation Charter, very unusual bit of contemporary portraiture. In Scotland, we really don't have any contemporary portraiture until 13th, 14th century. This is a 19th century Dutch painting, and he's even got the wrong king on there. That says 970, so we know that this is supposed to be Kenneth II, but he's written Kenneth III. All right, let's go on to the next one. Now, I do have a content warning on the next slide because everything after here is to do with sexual assault. There are lots of stories about it. Barbara York writes, it would appear that various rumours about Edgar's sexual predilections for nuns, which had reputedly earned him 7 years penance from Dunstan, were circulating in the late 11th and 12th centuries, and it does come up a lot. I find them a really interesting form of history writing. They're quite emotive, quite vivid stories, more than you often expect from medieval literature. I have little pictures of St. Edith down here. So Edgar has numerous children. The most famous, actually, could we just go back up a slide? Up one more, sorry. Okay, so, no, that's right. Okay, so these are the four most famous. Okay, so we have Edward the Martyr, who is probably murdered by his stepmother. We have St. Edith, different mothers. We have in Edgar what we call a serial monogamist. Okay. Doesn't engage in polyamory, but he does have a succession of wives. Okay, and then his third wife, we have Edmund, who was supposed to be the heir, but then he dies early, and then we have the infamous Ethelred the Unready as the last son. These are the most important ones. There are others, and it's a rare depiction of a woman in these regnal lists. This is 14th century regnal list, and she only appears because she was a saint, so the other daughters are ignored. So if you can pop down two more. So I have those three pictures of Edith there. That's right, we'll get to that one. So I've got those pictures of those three women there. Sorry, those three pictures of the same woman. And the reason I put them there on that content warning is that the woman that Edgar has sent Edith with is supposed to be a nun that he pulls out of vows. And then when she only has a daughter, he repudiates her and sends her and the little girl back to Wilton Abbey. Now, it's a good political move in some ways because now she can't remarry this woman who has been for even a short time a queen. But you can't just sort of put them there and ignore them because these are usually women from noble households. So she becomes the abbess and he gives her some quite substantial land grants. So she becomes a saint because she does all of this foundation activity for Wilton Abbey. But St. Edith then comes along And she becomes the big saint of Wilton Abbey. She builds a church for Saint Denis there. And the abbey, up until the dissolution of the monasteries, used an image of St. Edith on their seals. All right, so let's move on to the next one. Okay, so our first story of sexual indiscretions said King Edgar, so they say, on arriving at Andover, gave orders that a certain nobleman's daughter, whose reputation for beauty had become widespread, should be brought to him. Okay, so already we're getting sort of an unusual story compared to what we've seen before this. The girl's mother disdained to have her daughter treated as a concubine. Assisted by the cover of darkness, she sent a serving maid to sleep with him, who was a virgin not without some elegance and charm. And this is quite offensive, I think, to modern sensibilities. I don't think we're supposed to think ill in William's sort of framing. I don't think we're supposed to feel bad that the mother has done this. With a terrifying laugh, for his mind was in turmoil, with pity for the slave girl on the one hand and indignation against her mistress on the other, Edgar excused her regular duties and her punishment. Soon she was mistress of her ancient masters, whether they would or not. He raised her to a position of high honour and loved her and only her, remaining faithful until he took Althryth as his lawful wife. Now, what's interesting to me about this one is that William explicitly says this is an example of two vices, cruelty and lust. And I struggle to see the didacticism here. And it's definitely intended to be some. This is the way that William writes. I also struggle to see the cruelty. In modern sensibilities, there are obviously cruel moments. I think that what William is thinking of as the cruelty is that this mistress who tried to protect her daughter is suddenly subordinated to the servant. Okay, so we would, as modern viewers, would think that the mother was acting cruelly by sort of sacrificing this serving maid. We might think that King Edgar is acting cruelty by trying to sleep with this nobleman's daughter, but that's the example of lust. So we need to locate the example of cruelty. So yes, as I say, I suspect that we're supposed to think that his actions upon discovering the ruse are the cruel thing. And if you're thinking about this chronicle as being written for a very elite audience, well, that probably would have resonated. What more horrible thing could happen to you than have your servants placed on a higher status there? Now, coming back to the didacticism, Henry I had 24 illegitimate children, had lots of mistresses and concubines. And all I can really think of here at the moment, and I should have said at the start, a lot of this is notes towards a chapter as opposed to, fully formed thoughts. All I can think of here is that this is intended as a warning for Henry I. These are the sorts of actions that can lead from the type of behaviour that you're indulging yourself in. It's very much a 12th century story, a high medieval, almost romance story. We don't get these sorts of stories before the conquest in the early Middle Ages. That would be quite an unusual tale to come across. All right, let's go to the next slide. That was a Matthew Paris drawing, by the way. Right. So one of the nunnery tales, and we have a bunch of nunnery tales. So to this example of cruelty, they add an example of lust. Hearing of the beauty of a nun under vows, he removed her by violence from her convent, and having done so, violated her and forced her more than once to sleep with him. When this reached the ears of St. Dunstan, he was severely rebuked by the saint and did not refuse 7 years' penance, submitting, king though he was, to be ordered to fast, and at the same time forego wearing his crown for 7 years. Okay, so that's St. Dunstan there from the Claudius Pontificals. Near contemporary, but certainly not what he actually looked like. That's not the way portraiture works in this period. Now, I want to home in on 7 years penance there. I've mentioned it already. It's going to come up again and again and again to the point that it almost feels like it's something that probably did happen. And these sort of sexual indiscretions come up so often that you wonder if maybe there's some meat to that as well. Certainly a lot of historians give credit to these rumours. Again, something that's being transmitted through oral law that we don't see in contemporary chronicles, contemporary literature, because it would be rather impolitic to do that. But as soon as the West Saxon dynasty is off the throne, we start to get tales like this. But one of the other things that we need to think about is where these stories are coming from. Okay, so William writes this compendious history that goes from the arrival of Caesar to his own time, till Henry I's time. But the point here is that Edgar is only a small part of it. He's far more focused on St. Dunstan, and we're going to see this in the next couple of stories as well. We're actually getting Edgar's story through St. Dunstan's story. So St. Dunstan here then becomes the admonishing bishop, okay, which is a very important sort of figure. And Edgar becomes a good king, somehow becomes a good king through this, because he submits to St. Dunstan. Okay, so this is what William is trying to show Henry I. Henry I has been in conflict with his Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm of Bec, for the early part of his reign. When Anselm dies, Henry doesn't appoint another archbishop for 5 years. The archbishops of Canterbury, the clerical, ecclesiastical institutions, are losing their power. Kingship is becoming independent. William is pointing here not to Edgar's transgressions. That's not what he's interested in. He's interested in Edgar's redemption story. So he is submitting to the archbishop, doing what the archbishop tells him to do. Let's pop on to the next one. I thought this might happen. We've got too many stories to go through here. Eadgar of Canterbury. For on a certain occasion, this same king came to the monastery of virgins, which is located at Wilton, and there, captivated by the beauty of a certain young girl, ordered her to be secretly brought to him to speak. Okay, so we've got a real similar story to that one with the nobleman's daughter. While she was being led to him, out of fear for her chastity, she placed a veil snatched from one of the nuns on her head. When Edgar saw her wearing the veil, he said, "How suddenly you have become a nun." He grabbed and dragged the veil from her head while she resisted in vain with whatever strength she had. Thereupon he abused her, and the grave scandal caused by this wounded the spirit of every person throughout England. So Eadgar is writing at the turn of the 12th century. He's more or less William's contemporary. It's a far more robust version of this story, but this is found in a Life of St. Dunstan, St. Dunstan hagiography. So again, we're getting Edgar's story through the lens of Dunstan. If we pop onto the next slide, then we have the conclusion to the story. Edgar tries to, speak to Dunstan the next time they meet and tries to grab his hand, and Dunstan won't touch him. He says, "You have set aside all shame and committed adultery, disrespecting God. You did not show respect to the sign of chastity, and you despoiled the virginity of a young girl. And you ask me why I will not present to your impure hands my hands, which sacrifices the son of the virgin to the highest Father. First, cleanse your hands of their filth through penance, and only then honor and clasp the hand of the bishop, so that you may be reconciled to the grace of God." Edgar was terrified by these words. He threw himself on the ground and reached for the feet of the archbishop, for the bishop. So we're getting these same sort of stories coming through. I really think this is particularly strong imagery. We've got the repeated term virginity, but one of them is applied to Jesus, to the son of the virgin. So we've got this echoing of the importance of virginity and the importance that Dunstan is placing on this, and how transgressive this act by Edgar is. So after this, we get the 7 years penance again. And there is some confusion about where what story the 7 years penance should actually be applied to, because we get it through a variety of different instances, whether it's the nobleman's daughter, whether it's this nun. This nun could be Wulfrith, who is Edgar's second consort. That's what William of Malmesbury believes. We can pop onto the next slide. Okay, but because William believes it's Wulfrith, it's a sin too far for him. Okay, he does know this legacy of Edgar as an important figure in the church and a foundational figure for the English church. It's impossible for William to reconcile that. So he has this little counterpoint here where he says, "And sent Edith by Wulfrith, who was certainly not a nun at the time, but as a girl of lay status who had adopted the veil out of fear of the king, but later had it snatched away and was forced into royal marriage." So I've got the same story, but he's very much conscious of saying, look, she wasn't a nun. That didn't happen. Like, Edgar's not sleeping with nuns. That he wouldn't do that sort of thing. It's still the reason for the 7 years penance, but that's because St. Dunstan is such a holy guy, and so hot on his sanctity and his piety that even one who had passed through the shadow of a religious life was worthy of this sort of retribution, this 7 years worth of penance. Let's pop on to the next one. I'm conscious of time. So what happened at the nunnery? Okay, William of Malmesbury says Edgar abducts and rapes an unnamed nun. Dunstan imposes 7-year penance. 2, that Edgar takes Wulfthryth out of lay vows. He marries her, and Dunstan imposes an unknown penance. So we've got, he almost splits the story into 2, perhaps so that he can absolve Edgar of taking a nun out of vows when it comes to Wulfthryth, because again, that'd be quite the story to rape a nun and through that act beget a saint. That again is a little too far for William. He can't reconcile that with the positive reputation that Edgar has. So, and then he conflates these stories in the Gesta Pontificum Angorum, the history of the bishops of England. I've been talking about the history of the kings of England. And it's the abduction of Wulfthryth that earns Edgar a 7 years penance. So we've got multiple different stories coming through from William. And then he makes no mention of these stories at all in his Vita Dunstani. In Edmure of Canterbury, we have Edgar abducting and raping an unnamed lay student at a nunnery. Dunstan imposes a 7-year penance. And then in Osborne of Canterbury, we've got Edgar abducting and raping a nun who is the mother of his elder son, Edward. He's the only one that reports that. And then in B, a pseudonymous history of St. Dunstan that was written by an associate of the saint, none of this comes up. Okay, so if we pop on to the next one. Okay, I've dot pointed this because it's 300 lines of Anglo-Norman verse, and I'll speed through it because we are running short on time. This is very much a romance story. AR Press says our earliest known imaginative realization of a courtly love story. Edgar sends Ealdorman Ethelwald, not the same Ethelwald we've been talking about, different guy, names repeat, to check reports of this woman, Alfred's beauty. Ethelwald falls in love with Alfred. He lies to Edgar, marries her himself. Edgar goes on with his life. He trusts Ethelwald. But then he hears his knights talking about Alfred's beauty, intelligence and graciousness. The fact there are knights in this story already tells you we're in a different literary zeitgeist to the one that Edgar was actually historically a part of. Edgar goes on a pretend hunt that would bring him to Ethelwald's estates so as to create an excuse to meet Alfred. Edgar immediately falls in love, as does she, and almost gets carried away. But in that real Arthurian sort of style, they abstain and sort of exchange long looks across the mead hall. And that deceit uncovered, Edgar sends Ethelwald off to govern in northern England. This, if we switch on to the next slide, this is very much stolen from the Old Testament. We have David and Uriah here. David is sending Uriah off to war. Uriah is going to die, and then David can take Bathsheba as his concubine. So our Lord Athelwald, having obtained such writs as he required, now sets off. Going where he did, he came into contact with all sorts of outlaws and individuals hostile to him. What happened next was that he was killed like the common criminal that he was. Geoffrey absolutely despises Athelwald for this deceit. Some people say that it was King Edgar who sent him people like this for company. Okay, and it's very much the sense that Edgar, in the story, that Edgar is plotting Athelwald's death. William switches it. William is reconciling multiple biographies, not just Dunstan and Edgar's, but this Alfred. She's the one that possibly murdered King Edward the Martyr. She's the mother of Athelred the Unready. She looms very large over late 10th century history. And she gets a very negative reputation because she is, the wicked stepmother, etc. So for William of Malmesbury, she is actually the bad guy in this story. Because when Edgar shows up at the court, Athelwald quickly goes to Alfred and says, quick, can you go and make yourself look as ugly as possible? And she goes, no, I absolutely cannot do that. And she comes out absolutely frocked up. And Edgar immediately falls in love. And then Edgar is the person that kills Athelwold in this story. So he sent for the ealdormen to come hunting in the forest at Wherwell, and there pierced him with a javelin. And then we get this real odd bit of almost cruelty. It's almost scary at the end. When the bastard son of the dead man approached, the king asked him how he liked this kind of hunting. And the son replies, I liked it well, your majesty. What pleases you ought not to displease me. What else are you going to do? I mean, that javelin's still sitting there. And in William, that does something to change Edgar's heart. He sort of feels a little bit bad, and he adopts the son from that point. All right, let's go on to the next one. Okay, and then we have this confrontation with Dunstan and Geoffrey. Lo and behold, one morning, very early, Archbishop Dunstan came into the king's chamber and stood leaning pontifically against one of the red-painted panelled bedposts. I mean, it's quite casual, isn't it? Just to wander into the chamber. Speaking to the king in English, he demanded to know who it was lying with him in bed, to which the king replied, this is Queen Althryth, to whom this kingdom bends its knee in subjection. To which the archbishop replied, but wrongfully so, it would have been for you to be dead, better for you to be dead than wallowing in adultery in this way. The souls of both of you will suffer the torments of hell. And then unsurprisingly, Geoffrey goes on to say that earned Dunstan the eternal animosity of Queen Althryth. And historically, they do, after Edgar's death, wind up on different sides of the fight. So Dunstan will side with Edward the Martyr and actually get him on the throne, whereas Althryth will side with her son, Athelred the Unready. And obviously, if she does kill Edward the Martyr, then this is a retrospective story that knows all of this. So Geoffrey also is trying to reconcile multiple biographies. All right, next one. Okay, so I just wanted to give you some examples of the different things because I've lent really heavily on the scandal. But John of Worcester, Chronicon Chronicarum, one of the more important chronicles we have from this period. The rule of the English world, the flower and glory of the preceding kings, the peaceable King Edgar, no less memorable to the English than Romulus to the Romans. Cyrus to the Persians, Alexander to the Macedonians. Okay, so this is the best guy that we have. He reports none of these scandals, not interested in it. And he was in correspondence with William of Malmesbury. They shared sources. He didn't want any part of this scandalous nonsense because that's how he viewed it. You know, William tells us that he thinks it's nonsense, but he's still quite happy to report it. Just a Pontificum Anglorum, Canute would never, he's talking about Canute, King Canute is talking about St. Edith. Canute would never credit the sanctity of the daughter of King Edgar, a vicious man and a special slave to lust and more tyrant than king. And yet here in Vita Dunstani, we've got William Malmesbury saying, he was agreeable to the good, favourable to the pious, approachable to monks. Hardly a year passed when he did not do something great and politically important or found a new monastery. In his time, no one stole in private or plundered in public. At Henry of Huntington, which is another monumental history, he talks about his fame and he's known everywhere. Last slide. Okay, so I wanted to draw some conclusions because we're supposed to be talking about medieval writing, life writing, but I wound up just telling you a bunch of fun stories instead. Okay, so medieval lives, they draw on cultural memory, so evolving traditions around individual lives, whether written or oral, and they interweave them. Okay, so we've got William of Malmesbury there interweaving Dunstan and Edgar and Althryth's biographies in one of those stories. And he's having to respond to the cultural memory of each of these people. So that he's developing new traditions about individual lives, but he's still working within traditions of each of them. He is aware of the sort of piety of Edgar. He is aware of the absolute sanctity of Dunstan. He is aware of the negative reputation that Althryth has attracted, and he weaves them together into a story. Now, it's not a concerted biography. It's not intended to be a biography of any one of these people. Instead, what we get is life writing. We get senses of each of these people that then need to be correlated with other sources. They do respond to generic conventions, history, hagiography, romance. We saw that when we got to Geoffrey Gamer, we're talking about this sort of courtly love story, the nature of the story very much changed. They respond to contemporary political and religious concerns. These are definitely written for elite people. These are written for nobles, and usually with the hope that it winds up in front of the king. Okay, so it's going to do two things. It's going to flatter the kings and kingship, but it's also going to offer these didactic exemplars of kingship. And that's the final point. They are all interested in didacticism or usable past. The past offer lessons to the present. Okay, and that is well over time, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much.
I suppose I didn't want any questions.
Yeah, very briefly, just to get it on video in case we lose our recording, fortnight will be our final session, Friday the 16th of May with Nicole Kimball. We do have time for one or two questions, if there are any.
Yeah.
Yes.
That was really, really interesting. Can I ask you to complicate the story of the nuns slightly for us? There are, and without in any way wanting to diminish the power imbalances and the violence, stated in stories. It seems to me that there were an awful lot of women in abbeys who were not there because of any decision that they had made themselves, between oblates, foundlings, inconvenient daughters, whatever. Is it possible that this was always rape in the modern sense?
It's certainly treated that way, but we've got an interesting thing going on with Edgar, where these Wulfrith and her cousin, whose name starts with Wolf and the rest of it escapes me, they are noble women who are in, shall we say, lay vows. They're not actually nuns. And he seems to want to marry the cousin first, and she rejects him. And then he goes after Wulfrith. And this story about sort of snatching her for the nunnery, I suspect grows up because they're written retrospectively about a saint who is the mother of another saint. But at the time, I'm not convinced that that's actually what happened. Now, it doesn't mean that she wanted to marry him, because these women no more wanted to marry people than they wanted to go into nunneries. These are things that are arranged by the men. But I wouldn't be surprised if she was taken out of some sort of abbey school in order to become Edgar's consort, an arrangement made by her family. So I'm deeply suspicious of that story. But again, there are enough of these stories that you wonder if something may have happened there. But a lot, numerous of these noble women are there just because it's supposed to be a safe place. And this is the way the transgression is written. It's not even so much the act of rape as it's a nun. You can't pull a nun out of a nunnery. We don't hear about any of these other infidelities. And I'm sure there were others, but they're not as interesting to these clerical authors as the transgression of violating the safe space of the nunnery.
Michelle, and I think we'll have to wrap it up there.
Yeah, hi, sorry, can't see anything because the screen's still sharing, but that was fantastic, Matt. Always good to hear you talk about your work. I have a million different thoughts swirling in my mind, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to make a couple of comments, pose a couple of questions, and then, maybe you can go and think about something. It's more, well, first of all, I'm not as familiar in terms of chronology as you are, obviously, with all of your names and all of your kings. I'm actually looking at a list of all the different consorts here from your book. So I'm trying to relate this to, and again, I don't know, I'm not familiar enough with William of Malmesbury, Geoffrey Gamer, Eadmer of Canterbury, all those people. I'm not familiar enough to have the dates all in my head. So I'm trying to place all of this in the context of Henry II's reign and what's going on during his reign, to try and get that whole didactic link in my mind. Okay, one of the things you said is that a lot of these stories have a didactic purpose to them, right? And so I'm trying to think in terms of, well, what's Henry doing at that time? Is he not riffing? What's the word? Is he in conflict with Anselm? Is he in conflict with Thomas Becket at this time? What's he doing? And also in his personal life, when does the Rosamond thing come in? I think that's much later in his life, and it's probably after all of these betas, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But where the whole Anselm of Beck thing looms large over all of these stories, because Dunstan was an Archbishop of Canterbury. So
Yeah.
if we have this conflict, I don't think, we're talking, Adma's writing about 1105. William finishes Jester Regum Anglorum around 1225, 1226.
Yeah.
They're all very early. None of these are written any later than about 1225.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, we're not talking about Henry II here. Then we're talking about Stephen or
Henry I and then
Henry
Stephen.
I and then Stephen. Okay. Sorry, I got
That's
my
right.
Henry mixed
So
up.
Henry of Huntington addresses his history to Empress Matilda,
Yeah.
and William addresses Jester Regum to Henry I.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Okay. So I got my Henrys mixed up. So sorry about
Yeah,
that.
that's right. But you've still got the same sorts of themes coming through. Still conflict with the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yeah.
Again, I mean, I don't think we've got another king who produces quite as many illegitimate children as Henry I. And he's got something like, I think it's 24 illegitimate children with something like 15
ridiculous
different
number. Yeah. The other thing that
Sorry, on that note, we are a bit over time, so we do have to cut it off, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. Thank
and
you
we have
very much.
Thanks, Michelle. That was my fault.
Yeah.
It was a great talk. Thanks again. And we hope to see you in a fortnight. And take care. Have a good weekend.